The quiet stranger. Nolan Trent adjusted his cufflinks, the sunlight from the airport lounge window glinting off their polished surface. He reveled in the admiring, or perhaps irritated, glances of those around him. First-class boarding had its perks, and Nolan knew how to make an entrance. Clad in a tailored charcoal suit, his air of self-importance could have fueled the jet engines outside. He carried his leather briefcase as though it contained the secrets of the universe when, in truth, it was just his laptop and some sales reports. As the announcement for first-class passengers blared through the speakers, Nolan rose, ensuring everyone noticed. His shiny loafers clicked rhythmically as he strutted to the gate. This was his domain: high-end travel, exclusivity, and the quiet nods of acknowledgement from the staff. He handed his boarding pass to the attendant, who barely glanced at it before motioning him through. Stepping onto the aircraft, Nolan's eyes scanned the first-class cabin. The plush leather seats awaited their privileged occupants, and Nolan was determined to enjoy every ounce of the experience. He stowed his briefcase in the overhead bin above seat 2A and settled in, ordering a whiskey before the plane had even left the gate. He liked to set the tone early. He was important, and everyone should know it. Passengers trickled into the cabin, and Nolan barely paid them any mind. That was until an older man shuffled down the aisle, a simple duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He wasn't wearing a designer suit or sleek travel gear, just a worn brown jacket over a plaid shirt and scuffed shoes that had seen better days. His demeanor was quiet, unassuming, as though he didn't belong among the polished elite. The man paused at the seat across the aisle from Nolan, gently placing his bag beneath the seat before sitting down. He leaned back, gazing out the window with a serene expression. Nolan smirked, leaning slightly into the aisle to catch the man's attention. "First class sure isn't what it used to be," he muttered loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. The older man glanced at him briefly, his face a mask of calm. There was no anger, no hint of irritation, just a quiet acknowledgement before he returned his gaze to the window. His silence irritated Nolan. Feeling emboldened, Nolan pressed on. "What's the occasion? Retirement? Anniversary? Or maybe a lucky upgrade?" His tone was playful, laced with mockery. The man didn't flinch. He adjusted his seatbelt and continued staring out at the tarmac, as though Nolan hadn't spoken. The lack of reaction gnawed at Nolan, whose ego thrived on being noticed. "Unbelievable," Nolan muttered to himself, shaking his head. His words were met with uncomfortable glances from nearby passengers, who clearly wished he would drop it. The plane began to taxi, the rumble of the engines filling the cabin. As they ascended into the sky, Nolan's irritation grew. The man's calm demeanor felt almost confrontational, as if his indifference was a deliberate act to undermine Nolan's presence. Leaning into the aisle again, Nolan tried a different approach. "So," he said, his voice casual but loud enough for the man to hear, "what's it like treating yourself to first class for the first time?" This time, the man turned his head slowly, his expression still calm, but with an edge of curiosity. "It's comfortable," he replied simply, his voice steady and unbothered. Nolan blinked. He had expected defensiveness, embarrassment, anything but this quiet self-assurance. The man's response only fueled his desire to push further. "You know," Nolan said, setting his empty glass on the tray, "first class isn't just about the seat. It's about the people. The experience. You get what I mean." He leaned back with a smirk, confident in his superiority. The older man gave a small nod and turned back to the window, clearly uninterested in continuing the conversation. Nolan chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "Some people just don't get it," he muttered. The flight attendant approached with the beverage cart, her professional smile unwavering. She poured another whiskey for Nolan before turning to the older man. "Coffee or tea, Mr. Hart?" she asked, her tone shifting ever so slightly. There was a warmth in her voice that hadn't been there when she addressed Nolan. "Black coffee, please," the man replied, his voice calm and polite. As the flight attendant prepared his drink, Nolan noticed the way her demeanor softened in the man's presence. It was subtle but unmistakable. Respect. The older man accepted his coffee with a nod of thanks, his focus returning to the window. Nolan watched him, unease creeping into his chest. There was something about this man that felt off. Not in a bad way, but in a way that Nolan couldn't quite place. He leaned forward again, determined to crack the mystery. "You remind me of someone," Nolan said, his tone feigning curiosity. "Ever thought about Hollywood? You've got that rugged look." The man didn't react to the comment. He sipped his coffee, his calm demeanor unshaken. The flight attendant returned to refill his cup, and this time she leaned in slightly. "It's an honor to have you on board, Mr. Hart," she said in a lower voice. Nolan froze. "Mr. Hart," he whispered under his breath, his mind racing. That name sounded familiar, too familiar. And then it hit him. His eyes widened as he pieced it together. This wasn't just some quiet retiree. This was Calvin Hart, the legendary filmmaker and actor whose work had defined generations. Known for his humility and grounded nature, Hart was a name Nolan had heard countless times, but never expected to encounter in such an unassuming setting. The realization hit Nolan like a tidal wave. His chest tightened as he replayed every mocking word he'd said earlier. His arrogance had blinded him, and now he felt the weight of his own foolishness. The whispers started around him. Other passengers began to recognize Hart, craning their necks for a better look. Nolan's face flushed as he shrank back into his seat, suddenly wishing he could disappear. But the real lesson was only just beginning. A moment of clarity. As the plane steadied at cruising altitude, Nolan sat rigid in his seat. The realization of who he had been mocking settled over him like a heavy fog. Calvin Hart wasn't just a name. It was a legacy. A man whose films had shaped generations, whose directorial work had earned countless accolades, and whose influence reached far beyond the silver screen. To the world, he was a giant. To Nolan, he was the man he had just belittled for the past 20 minutes. Nolan's stomach churned as the cabin buzzed with hushed whispers. Passengers glanced at Hart with growing recognition, their eyes darting back and forth between the quiet legend and the man who had been loudly mocking him. The tension in the air was palpable, and Nolan felt it more acutely with every passing second. For a moment, Nolan considered apologizing right then and there, but his ego wrestled with his conscience. What would he even say? "Sorry I treated you like dirt, because I thought you were beneath me." The thought made him cringe. Instead, he busied himself with his tablet, scrolling aimlessly through emails he wasn't reading, his thoughts consumed by the encounter. Hart, on the other hand, remained composed. He sipped his coffee, occasionally glancing out the window as if the drama unfolding around him didn't exist. His calm presence only magnified Nolan's discomfort. How could someone be so unbothered? It was almost maddening. The flight attendant returned, offering refills and snacks. When she reached Hart, her demeanor softened again, her respect evident in every word and gesture. "Mr. Hart, we have some fresh pastries from the galley. Would you like one?" Hart gave her a polite smile. "No, thank you," he said, his voice even and kind. "I'm all set." Nolan clenched his jaw, the contrast between Hart's humility and his own behavior striking him like a slap to the face. For years, Nolan had prided himself on his success, his ability to command respect in any room. Yet here was a man who commanded not just respect, but genuine admiration, and he did it effortlessly. Nolan couldn't resist sneaking another glance at Hart. His face was weathered, lined with the marks of a life well lived. His hands, though steady, bore the faint scars of years spent on sets, working tirelessly to bring stories to life. There was a quiet strength about him, a presence that Nolan couldn't ignore. Finally, the weight of his discomfort became too much. Nolan leaned slightly across the aisle, his voice hesitant. "Mr. Hart," he began, his usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. I didn't realize it was you." Hart turned his head slowly, his calm gaze meeting Nolan's. For a moment, the cabin seemed to grow quieter, as though everyone was waiting to see how this exchange would unfold. "Didn't realize what?" Hart asked, his tone measured. Nolan hesitated, fumbling for the right words. "I didn't realize who you were," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Hart's expression didn't change. "And if you had?" he asked simply. The question hung in the air, heavier than Nolan had expected. He opened his mouth to respond, but quickly realized he had no good answer. What difference did it make? Would he have treated Hart better if he'd known? The truth was painfully obvious, and it gnawed at him. Hart didn't press him further. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, his attention shifting once again to the window. The silence that followed was deafening. Nolan felt the stares of the other passengers, their judgment almost tangible. As the flight attendant passed by again, she paused near Hart, a genuine smile on her face. "If there's anything you need, Mr. Hart, don't hesitate to ask." Hart nodded appreciatively. "Thank you," he replied. Nolan watched the interaction with a sinking feeling in his chest. It wasn't just the respect Hart commanded that struck him. It was the way he handled it. He didn't demand attention or bask in the admiration of others. He simply existed, and that was enough. The realization hit Nolan like a freight train. His entire life had been built around the pursuit of recognition, the constant need to prove his worth. Yet here was a man who had achieved more than Nolan could ever dream of, and he did so without arrogance or pretense. The whispers in the cabin began to die down as passengers settled into the quiet rhythm of the flight. Nolan's mind, however, was anything but quiet. He replayed the earlier exchange in his head, each word cutting deeper than the last. His mocking tone, his dismissive comments, it all seemed so petty now, so small. Finally, Nolan couldn't take it anymore. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and staring at the floor. The voice in his head, the one that always told him he was better, smarter, more deserving, was silent for the first time in years. In its place was a quiet but insistent question. What kind of person am I? Across the aisle, Hart sat peacefully, his calm presence a stark contrast to the storm raging in Nolan's mind. The flight was only halfway over, but for Nolan, it felt like an eternity. He knew he couldn't undo his earlier behavior, but maybe, just maybe, he could learn from it. The thought gave him a glimmer of hope, though it was quickly overshadowed by the weight of his shame. Nolan had always believed that success was everything, that status and recognition were the ultimate goals. But now, for the first time, he was beginning to see the hollowness of that belief. As the plane continued its journey, Nolan made a silent promise to himself. He didn't know what he was going to say to Hart, but he knew he had to say something. Not for Hart's sake, but for his own. For the first time in a long time, Nolan felt the stirrings of humility, and it terrified him. Hart sipped his coffee, seemingly oblivious to the inner turmoil unfolding across the aisle. But Nolan had a feeling that Hart knew. He had seen men like Nolan before, and he knew exactly what kind of lesson they needed to learn. The question was whether Nolan was ready to learn it. And as the plane soared through the clouds, Nolan couldn't help but wonder, was it too late to change? The weight of reflection. The cabin hummed with the low murmur of passengers chatting softly, the occasional clink of glasses punctuating the air. But for Nolan, the world felt unnervingly still. He sat slouched in his seat, his gaze fixed on the digital screen in front of him. Though he wasn't watching the movie playing, his mind was elsewhere, consumed by the quiet humiliation that had begun to settle into something heavier, self-awareness. Across the aisle, Calvin Hart seemed to radiate calm, his posture relaxed as he sipped from his coffee cup. Nolan couldn't understand how the man could be so unbothered. The indifference he had shown earlier, when Nolan had mocked him, wasn't one of arrogance. It was something deeper, confidence, perhaps, or wisdom. Whatever it was, it unnerved Nolan more than he cared to admit. He replayed the interaction in his mind, wincing at the memory of his smug remarks. How could he have been so blind? It wasn't just that he'd insulted someone famous. It was the realization that he had judged Hart. No, dismissed him, based entirely on appearance. The thought gnawed at Nolan, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a pang of shame that wouldn't go away. The flight attendant's voice broke his train of thought as she approached their row. "Mr. Hart," she said with that same respectful tone, "we've prepared a special meal for you, courtesy of the airline. Would you like me to bring it now?" Hart smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both gratitude and humility. "Thank you, but I'm fine. I'm not very hungry," he said, his deep voice steady. The attendant nodded, her smile lingering as she walked away. Nolan noticed how she moved with purpose, her professionalism intact, but her demeanor around Hart was different. It wasn't just admiration, it was reverence. Nolan swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. That reverence was earned, he realized. Hart wasn't trying to command respect. It was given to him naturally because of who he was. And Nolan? He had spent his entire adult life demanding it, flaunting his accomplishments and status like trophies. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at Hart again. The older man was now looking out the window, seemingly lost in thought. For the first time, Nolan wondered what kind of life Hart had lived to earn such respect. He knew the basics, of course. Hart's name was synonymous with legendary films, directorial masterpieces, and a legacy that spanned decades. But beyond the accolades, who was the man sitting just a few feet away? The curiosity gnawed at him, and against his better judgment, Nolan leaned into the aisle again. "Mr. Hart," he began, his voice quieter than before. Hart turned to him, his expression neutral but not unkind. "Yes." Nolan hesitated, suddenly unsure of what to say. The words he had rehearsed in his mind felt inadequate. I just wanted to say that I'm a big fan of your work," he finally stammered, feeling his face heat up. Hart tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "Thank you," he said simply. The brevity of the response caught Nolan off guard. He had expected something more, a conversation, perhaps, or at least a hint of acknowledgement that his words mattered. But Hart had given him nothing to lash onto, and it left Nolan feeling even smaller. "You've made some incredible films," Nolan added, his voice tinged with desperation. "Real classics." Hart nodded again, this time with a faint smile. "I appreciate that," he said, his tone kind but measured. The silence that followed was suffocating. Nolan leaned back in his seat, feeling the sting of rejection, though he knew Hart hadn't been rude. It was just that the older man's presence, his calm and unshakable demeanor, seemed to magnify Nolan's flaws in ways he couldn't escape. For a while, Nolan sat in silence, his thoughts churning. He thought about the life he had built, the career, the accolades, the polished image he worked so hard to maintain. On paper, he was successful. He had the money, the prestige, the connections. But now, for the first time, he wondered if any of it really mattered. Hart had said only a few words to him, yet those words carried more weight than Nolan cared to admit. "Respect isn't about the other person. It's about you." The phrase replayed in his mind like a haunting melody, each repetition peeling back another layer of his carefully constructed facade. Nolan thought about his childhood, growing up in a modest home where his parents had instilled in him the value of hard work. Somewhere along the way, that lesson had twisted into something else. Hard work became a means to an end, a way to climb the ladder and leave everyone else behind. But now, sitting across from Calvin Hart, Nolan felt the emptiness of that pursuit more acutely than ever. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, jolting him out of his thoughts. The cabin lights flickered briefly before stabilizing. Nolan glanced around, noticing that most of the other passengers seemed unfazed. Hart, too, remained composed, his hands resting lightly on the armrests. It was a small moment, but it struck Nolan deeply. How could someone be so steady, so unaffected by the chaos around them? It wasn't just about the turbulence. It was about life itself. Hart exuded a quiet strength that Nolan couldn't understand, let alone replicate. Finally, Nolan made a decision. He leaned forward again, his voice more confident this time. "Mr. Hart," he said, his tone sincere, "I owe you an apology." Hart turned to him, his expression thoughtful. "Oh," he said, raising an eyebrow. Nolan took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "I was out of line earlier," he admitted. "I made assumptions about you, about who you were, based on nothing more than appearances. And that was wrong." Hart studied him for a moment, his gaze penetrating but not unkind. "It takes courage to admit that," he said finally. "Most people don't." Nolan felt a flicker of relief, but also a sense of vulnerability he hadn't experienced in years. "I've been thinking about what you said," he continued, "about respect. And you're right. It's not about the other person, it's about me. The way I treat people says more about who I am than anything else." Hart nodded slowly, his expression softening. "It's a lesson some people never learn," he said. "But it's never too late." The words hit Nolan like a lifeline, pulling him out of the pit of self-doubt he had been spiraling into. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that he could change, that he could become the kind of person who earned respect rather than demanded it. The rest of the flight passed in a contemplative silence. Nolan didn't try to force a conversation with Hart, nor did he feel the need to. Instead, he allowed himself to sit with his thoughts, to reflect on the kind of man he had become, and the kind of man he wanted to be. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, Nolan glanced across the aisle one last time. Hart was gazing out the window, his expression serene. In that moment, Nolan realized that Hart's strength didn't come from his fame or his accomplishments. It came from something deeper, something Nolan was just beginning to understand. And as the city lights of Los Angeles came into view, Nolan made a silent vow to himself, to be better, not just for the world, but for himself. Because if there was one thing Calvin Hart had taught him, it was that respect wasn't about appearances, it was about integrity. And that was a lesson Nolan would carry with him for the rest of his life. The crossroads of identity. The plane began its gentle descent, the sprawling lights of Los Angeles illuminating the horizon like a sea of stars. Nolan Trent stared out the window, though he barely registered the glittering city below. His mind churned with thoughts, each one peeling back the layers of the person he built himself to be. For the first time in years, Nolan felt raw, exposed. He was a man at a crossroads, and he knew it. Across the aisle, Calvin Hart remained a quiet enigma. The older man sat with his hands resting on his lap, his gaze out the window as though the world outside was more fascinating than anything happening in the cabin. His presence was steady, grounding, even without words. And it was infuriating. Nolan had built his life around the idea that power came from commanding a room, from being loud and dominant. But Hart's power was something else entirely. It came from within, a quiet confidence that Nolan couldn't ignore. The captain's voice came over the intercom, breaking the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final descent into Los Angeles. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are in their upright positions. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." The flurry of activity around him barely registered. Nolan was lost in thought, replaying the moments that had brought him to this point. Every mocking word, every smug glance, each memory hit like a punch to the gut. He had always believed himself to be a man of substance, someone others looked up to. But now, sitting just feet away from Calvin Hart, Nolan felt like a fraud. The whispers in the cabin had died down, though a few passengers still cast glances toward Hart, their expressions a mixture of awe and curiosity. Nolan noticed them but felt no envy. Instead, he felt an ache, a yearning to understand how Hart could command such respect without demanding it. The plane hit a small pocket of turbulence, jostling the cabin. Nolan gripped the armrests reflexively, his heart racing for a moment before the turbulence passed. He glanced across the aisle at Hart, who remained unflinching, his composure unbroken. It was such a small thing, but it spoke volumes. Nolan couldn't help himself. "You don't get rattled, do you?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Hart turned to him, his expression calm. "There's no use in getting rattled over things you can't control," he replied simply. The words hit Nolan harder than they should have. They were so obvious, so straightforward, and yet they carried a weight that Nolan couldn't shake. How many times had he let himself be consumed by things he couldn't control? How many times had his arrogance been a mask for insecurity? "Is that something you learned over time?" Nolan asked, his tone more sincere than he intended. Hart regarded him for a moment, as though weighing whether to answer. "It's something I've learned through experience," he said finally. "Life has a way of teaching you what really matters, if you're willing to listen." Nolan nodded slowly, the words settling in his chest like a heavy stone. He wanted to ask more, to peel back the layers of the man who had so effortlessly exposed his flaws. But something held him back. Perhaps it was fear of what he might uncover about himself. The plane began its final approach, the city below growing larger with each passing second. Nolan's heart raced, though not from the descent. He knew he was running out of time. If he didn't say what he needed to say now, he might never get the chance. As the flight attendants made their final rounds, collecting empty cups and checking seatbelts, Nolan took a deep breath. He leaned slightly into the aisle, his voice steady but tentative. "Mr. Hart," he began, "can I ask you something?" Hart turned to him, his expression patient. "Of course. How do you do it?" Nolan asked, the words tumbling out before he could second-guess himself. "How do you stay so grounded? You've accomplished so much, and yet you don't act like it. You don't seem to care about recognition or status." Hart's lips quirked into a faint smile, though it wasn't one of amusement. "I care about what matters," he said. "The rest is just noise." Nolan frowned, his brow furrowing. "But how do you know what matters? How do you filter out the noise?" Hart leaned back in his seat, his gaze thoughtful. "It's not about filtering," he said. "It's about focus. You have to decide what kind of person you want to be and let that guide you. For me, it's about integrity, respect, treating people with kindness, no matter who they are. Everything else falls into place when you get those things right." The simplicity of the answer left Nolan speechless. He had spent years chasing success, building an image, striving to be seen as important. But Hart's words made him realize how hollow those pursuits were. What good was success if it didn't come with integrity? What good was recognition if it wasn't earned? The plane touched down smoothly, the wheels screeching against the runway. The passengers around them began to stir, gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. Nolan remained seated, his thoughts racing. He felt like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into an unknown abyss. The question was whether he had the courage to jump. Hart stood, retrieving his modest duffel bag from the overhead bin with ease. He slung it over his shoulder and turned toward the aisle, his movements unhurried. Nolan watched him, the weight of his earlier words pressing down on him like a tidal wave. Before Hart could step into the aisle, Nolan stood abruptly, his voice halting. "Mr. Hart," he said. "Thank you." Hart paused, turning to face him. His calm gaze met Nolan's, and for a moment, the world seemed to still. "For what?" Hart asked, his tone genuine. "For the lesson," Nolan said, his voice quieter now. "I needed it." Hart studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a small nod, a gesture that carried more meaning than any words could. Without another word, he turned and walked down the aisle, his presence lingering even after he was gone. As Nolan sat back down, watching the other passengers file out, he felt a strange sense of clarity. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He was done chasing an illusion. It was time to rebuild, to become the kind of man who earned respect not through status, but through character. And as he stepped off the plane into the bustling terminal of Lax, Nolan Trent carried with him a newfound determination, a determination to change, to grow, and to finally listen to the lessons life had been trying to teach him all along. The shadows of humility. The terminal at Los Angeles International Airport was alive with motion. Passengers rushing to catch flights, families reuniting with embraces, and business people weaving through the crowd with practiced efficiency. Yet Nolan Trent felt like he was moving in slow motion. Each step he took toward the baggage plane was heavy, as though the conversation on the plane had anchored him to a new reality he wasn't ready to face. He had always thought of himself as a man in control. His polished appearance, confident stride, and sharp tongue had been his tools for years, carving a path through the competitive world of high-stakes business. But now, for the first time, Nolan felt unarmed. His defenses, once so sturdy, had been dismantled in a single flight by a man who had barely raised his voice. Calvin Hart. The name echoed in Nolan's mind, a constant reminder of the lesson he hadn't asked for but desperately needed. Respect isn't about the other person, it's about you. Those words had lodged themselves deep in Nolan's chest, forcing him to confront the man he'd become. As Nolan approached the baggage carousel, he caught sight of Hart standing a short distance away. The older man was alone, his modest duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his posture relaxed as he watched the bags begin to emerge from the chute. There was no entourage, no flash of paparazzi cameras, just Hart, blending into the crowd as though he were no different from anyone else. Nolan hesitated. Part of him wanted to approach Hart again, to say something more, but he wasn't sure what. The humility he had begun to feel on the plane was unfamiliar territory, and he wasn't sure how to navigate it. What could he possibly say that wouldn't sound forced or insincere? Before he could make up his mind, Hart turned and caught his gaze. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the chaos of the terminal fading into the background. Then, with a small nod, Hart turned and walked toward the exit, disappearing into the crowd as easily as he had appeared. Nolan exhaled, the tension in his chest loosening slightly. It wasn't disappointment he felt, more like a sense of inevitability. Hart had said what needed to be said, and now it was up to Nolan to figure out what to do with it. Later that evening, Nolan found himself in his sleek, minimalist apartment in downtown Los Angeles. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city's skyline, but Nolan barely noticed. He sat on the edge of his leather couch, a glass of whiskey untouched on the coffee table in front of him. His phone buzzed intermittently with notifications, emails, texts, and social media alerts, but he ignored them all. He couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted within him. For years, Nolan had defined himself by his success. The tailored suits, the luxury car, the exclusive memberships, all of it had been part of the image he projected to the world. But now, sitting alone in his carefully curated apartment, Nolan realized how hollow it all felt. He thought about the people he had dismissed over the years, the colleagues he had brushed aside, the strangers he had ignored, the relationships he had let wither because they didn't serve his ambitions. How many Calvins had he overlooked in his pursuit of status? How many opportunities to learn and grow had he squandered because of his arrogance? The thought was almost too much to bear. Nolan stood abruptly, pacing the room as though movement might help him escape his thoughts. His reflection caught his eye in the window, and he paused, staring at the man looking back at him. The image was flawless. The perfectly styled hair, the sharp lines of his tailored shirt, the expensive watch on his wrist. But Nolan didn't see the success he had once prided himself on. Instead, he saw a man who had spent years hiding behind a mask. He turned away from the window, running a hand through his hair. For the first time in years, Nolan felt lost. The confidence that had carried him through life was gone, replaced by an uncomfortable vulnerability. But beneath that vulnerability was something else, a flicker of hope. Nolan sat back down, his mind drifting to the words Hart had spoken on the plane. You have to decide what kind of person you want to be and let that guide you. It was such a simple idea, but it felt monumental in its implications. Nolan had spent so much time chasing success that he had never stopped to ask himself what kind of man he wanted to be. That night, Nolan made a decision. He didn't know what the path forward would look like, but he knew he couldn't continue down the road he'd been on. It was time to let go of the illusions he had built around himself and start searching for something real. The next morning, Nolan woke early, the faint light of dawn filtering through the curtains. For once, he didn't reach for his phone or check his schedule. Instead, he brewed a pot of coffee and sat at the small table by the window, watching the city come to life. As he sipped his coffee, Nolan felt a strange sense of calm. The anxiety that had plagued him the night before had receded, replaced by a quiet determination. He didn't have all the answers, but he didn't need them. For the first time in years, Nolan was willing to admit that he didn't have everything figured out, and that was okay. He spent the morning in reflection, jotting down thoughts and memories in a notebook he had found buried in a drawer. It felt strange at first, putting pen to paper after years of living in the digital world, but it also felt grounding. He wrote about his encounter with Calvin Hart, about the lessons he had learned, and about the man he wanted to become. By the time the sun was fully up, Nolan felt lighter than he had in years. He didn't know where this new path would take him, but he was ready to follow it, one step at a time. For the first time, Nolan wasn't chasing success. He was chasing meaning, and that, he realized, was a far more worthy pursuit. The rest of the day unfolded differently than Nolan could have imagined. For the first time in years, he ignored his meticulously planned schedule. No calls to push deals forward, no meticulously curated posts to enhance his public image, and no late afternoon meetings designed to flaunt his status. Instead, he spent the day taking stock, not of his career or his possessions, but of himself. Nolan pulled open a drawer in his study, searching for something to ground him. Beneath a pile of documents and old business cards, he found a worn leather-bound journal he hadn't touched in over a decade. He opened it gingerly, the scent of aged paper and faint ink pulling him back to his early 20s. The first entry was dated the day he landed his first corporate internship. "I want to be the best. Not just good. Great. People will know my name. I'll work harder, longer, smarter than anyone else. I won't stop until I'm at the top." Nolan's lips twitched into a bitter smile. He remembered writing those words with a pen he had borrowed from a receptionist, sitting in the corner of a coffee shop because he couldn't yet afford a workspace. At the time, his ambitions had been pure, or so he had convinced himself. But looking at the words now, he saw something else. Insecurity. A fear of being left behind, of being insignificant. That fear had driven him ever since. He flipped through the pages, the entries growing sparser as the years went on. The eager optimism of the early pages gave way to cold, factual summaries of accomplishments, promotions, milestones, and material achievements. There were no mentions of people, no reflections on relationships or connections. The journal mirrored his life, empty in all the places that mattered. Nolan closed the journal and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He could no longer pretend he was satisfied with the life he'd built. It was time to face the truth. He wasn't at peace. He wasn't happy. And if he continued down this path, he never would be. By mid-afternoon, Nolan felt an urge to step outside. He left his high-rise apartment for a walk through the streets of downtown Los Angeles, trading the sterile quiet of his home for the vibrant, chaotic energy of the city. The sound of car horns, the chatter of pedestrians, and the distant hum of street performers filled the air. He passed a small park he'd walked by countless times but never entered. This time, he stopped, drawn by the sight of children playing on a jungle gym and families gathered on picnic blankets. It was an ordinary scene, but it felt profound to Nolan. These people weren't striving for status or recognition. They were simply living, finding joy in the moment. Nolan sat on a bench near the edge of the park, watching the world unfold around him. For years, he had dismissed moments like this as unproductive, a waste of time. Now he saw them for what they were, the essence of life. As he sat there, a man in his 50s approached the bench and gestured toward the empty spot beside him. "Mind if I sit?" Nolan shook his head. Go ahead. The man lowered himself onto the bench with a small sigh, holding a to-go coffee cup in one hand. Nice day, isn't it? Nolan nodded, though he hadn't paid attention to the weather until now. The sun was warm but not oppressive, and a light breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass. Yeah, it is. The man smiled, taking a sip of his coffee. I come here every Sunday, he said. My wife and I used to bring our kids here when they were little. They're grown now, but I still like to come and sit. Reminds me of the important stuff, you know. Nolan glanced at him, struck by the simplicity of the statement. The important stuff. How long had it been since Nolan had considered what that meant for him? His definition of important had been tied to deadlines, profits, and prestige for so long that he'd lost sight of everything else. What do you think is important? Nolan found himself asking, his voice softer than usual. The man chuckled, a warm and genuine sound. Oh, that's a big question, he said. But for me, it's family. Connection. Treating people well. None of the rest of it matters much if you don't have those things. Nolan stared at the man, his chest tightening. The words reminded him of what Hart had said. It's not about the other person. It's about you. Treating people well, showing respect, building meaningful connections. That was the foundation of the life Nolan had been missing. Thanks, Nolan said after a moment, his voice barely audible. The man smiled again, tipping his coffee cup in a small salute. Anytime, he said before rising from the bench and walking away, leaving Nolan alone with his thoughts. That evening, Nolan sat down at his dining table with a blank notebook in front of him. He had made a decision. He would rebuild his life. But this time, he would do it with purpose. He wouldn't measure his worth by his net worth or the number of LinkedIn endorsements he had. Instead, he would focus on the kind of person he wanted to be. He wrote a single sentence at the top of the page. What kind of legacy do I want to leave? For the next hour, Nolan wrote freely, allowing his thoughts to flow without judgment. He wrote about the relationships he wanted to repair, the people he wanted to treat with more kindness, and the humility he hoped to cultivate. He wrote about the lessons he had learned from Calvin Hart, and how those lessons would guide him moving forward. By the time he set down his pen, Nolan felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He didn't have all the answers, but he had taken the first step, and for the first time in years, that felt like enough. As the city lights twinkled outside his window, Nolan closed the notebook and leaned back in his chair. He thought of Calvin Hart, the quiet man who had unknowingly changed his life in the span of a single flight. Nolan hoped he would have the chance to thank him someday, not for his fame or his achievements, but for the wisdom he had shared. Because if Nolan had learned anything, it was this. True success wasn't about wealth or status. It was about the impact you left on others. And Nolan was determined to leave a better legacy than the one he had been building. The first step forward. The following weeks were a whirlwind of change for Nolan Trent. What began as a quiet resolution on that fateful flight quickly evolved into a transformative journey, reshaping not only how he approached his work, but also his relationships and life itself. He had spent years cultivating a persona that thrived on power and recognition, but now he was dismantling that image brick by brick. The process wasn't easy, but Nolan had never been more determined. His first step was to address the people in his professional life, those he had dismissed, undermined, or used as stepping stones. He started with his team at work, the colleagues he had taken for granted in his climb to the top. Nolan scheduled a meeting, surprising everyone with his unusually candid tone in the email invitation. The team gathered in the conference room, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Nolan stood at the head of the table, his usual air of authority softened. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure how to begin. But then he remembered Calvin Hart's calm demeanor, the steady way he had spoken, and Nolan drew strength from that memory. I owe all of you an apology, he said, his voice steady but humble. For years, I've treated this team as a means to an end. I focused on results, on numbers, and on my own success, often at the expense of your contributions and well-being. That was wrong. The room was silent. Some of his colleagues exchanged surprised glances, while others simply stared at him, trying to gauge his sincerity. I've realized that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn, Nolan continued. And I haven't earned it from you. But I want to change that. One of the senior team members, a woman named Rachel, leaned forward, her brow furrowed. What brought this on, Nolan? I mean, we've all worked with you for years. And this feels different. Nolan nodded, grateful for the opening to explain. It's a long story, he said, his lips quirking into a small smile. But let's just say I had a wake-up call. Someone showed me what real integrity looks like, and I realized I've been falling short. The room remained quiet, the weight of his words sinking in. Nolan didn't expect immediate forgiveness or trust, but he knew he had taken the first step. Over time, he hoped his actions would speak louder than his words. In his personal life, Nolan's changes were even more profound. He reached out to his estranged younger brother, Marcus, whom he hadn't spoken to in years. Their falling out had been over something trivial, but Nolan's pride had kept the distance alive. Now, as he dialed Marcus's number, his heart pounded with a mixture of anxiety and hope. Hello. Marcus's voice was cautious, uncertain. Hey, it's Nolan, he said, his voice softer than usual. I know it's been a long time, but I was wondering if we could talk. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Nolan braced himself for rejection. But then Marcus sighed, his tone softening. Yeah, we can talk. The conversation wasn't easy. Nolan apologized for his arrogance, for always putting his ambitions ahead of their relationship, and for never admitting he was wrong. To his relief, Marcus listened, and by the end of the call, they had tentatively agreed to meet for coffee. It was a small step, but for Nolan, it felt monumental. In quieter moments, Nolan reflected on how far he had come. He often revisited the journal he had started the day after the flight, filling its pages with thoughts, lessons, and aspirations. The act of writing became a form of therapy, helping him process the changes he was undergoing and solidify his newfound values. One evening, as he sat by the window of his apartment, watching the city lights twinkle below, Nolan thought of Calvin Hart. The older man's calm presence and quiet wisdom had left an indelible mark on him. Nolan wondered if Hart knew the impact he had on people, not through grand gestures or loud proclamations, but through simple acts of kindness and humility. The thought inspired Nolan to write a letter. He didn't know where to send it, or if Hart would ever read it, but it felt important to express his gratitude. Dear Mr. Hart, I'm not sure if you'll remember me, but we sat across the aisle from each other on a flight from Phoenix to Los Angeles a few weeks ago. You probably don't know this, but that short flight changed my life. For years, I've measured my success by my accomplishments, my status, and how others perceived me. I treated people as though they were obstacles or tools, rather than as individuals deserving of respect. But something about your calm presence and the words you shared with me made me stop and reflect on the person I'd become. You taught me a lesson I didn't even know I needed. That respect isn't about the other person. It's about who we are and how we choose to treat others. Those words have stayed with me every day since, guiding me as I try to rebuild my life with integrity and purpose. I want to thank you, not just for your wisdom, but for the example you set. You reminded me that true strength comes from humility, kindness, and self-respect, not from power or recognition. I don't know if this letter will ever reach you, but I wanted you to know the impact you've had. You've helped me see the world and myself in a new light, and for that, I'll always be grateful. Sincerely, Nolan Trent. Nolan sealed the letter and set it aside, resolving to find a way to send it in the coming days. Whether or not Hart ever read it, the act of writing it felt like closure, a way to honor the man who had inspired his transformation. As Nolan leaned back in his chair, a quiet sense of peace washed over him. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time, He felt like he was on the right path. The man he had been was fading into the past, and in his place, a better version of Nolan Trent was beginning to emerge. The journey wasn't over, but it was no longer daunting. It was exciting. A chance to build something real, something meaningful. And as he stared out at the city below, Nolan felt a quiet determination settle in his chest. The first step had been taken. The rest would follow.